All right. So in this session, I'm going to share with you about the cost of education in six different regions: US, UK, Canada, Europe, Singapore, and India. So six regions. And while we talk about how much does it cost to study in all these different countries, I want you to make a note of the following points: that usually the cost of studying medicine or specialized program is different. In most cases, the cost of studying medicine is higher than all the other courses or programs. The cost of education that I'm presenting right now today is the cost for the 21-22 year, that is the current academic year. The cost or the fees increases gradually every year. That is something you should all be aware of, that every year it roughly increases by 5 to 8%. So take that into consideration. Again, the cost that I've taken here is the average fees. For some students, the cost might be a little lower if they're offered the scholarships, or it can be higher also, depending upon the courses that they are taking. Uh, Also consider the fact that the currency fluctuation is also there. That means if you are applying to colleges in the US or UK or other Europe, there is currency fluctuation to be taken into consideration. That is, usually the currency will fluctuate anywhere from 1% to 4 to 5%. So those factors should also be considered. And finally, while we talk about cost of education in various countries, also think of the fact that the cost would vary between various colleges and universities within the same country as well, right? And finally, the point to note here is that while you are calculating the overall cost of a course or overall cost of a program, you should be aware, or you should also take into consideration whether the course is a 3-year course or a 4-year course, because the overall cost of the whole program will vary if you are taking a 3-year course or a 4-year course, right? So those are some of the factors that you need to think about or consider while you are trying to assess the cost of education in various countries. Now, as we speak about the cost of education, first of all, we need to know what all are the different costs which are associated when it comes to studying in India or studying abroad. Number one is tuition fees. Now, when it comes to tuition fees, usually the cost of tuition fees is not to be paid at once to the colleges. The cost is broken down usually into 2 installments or sometimes 3 installments as per the semester. So when parents are thinking about how they need to pay the money to the college, they must be educated about the fact that the cost is not paid at once, but it is paid in multiple trenches or in multiple installments. Second thing is about living expenses. Again, living expenses are not paid at once, but it's paid in either 2 installments, or some expenses are done as and when you sort of make those expenses. Like living expenses are done, like let's say you talk about your day-to-day expenses. So those are not done at once, but those are done on a day-to-day basis. So the cash flow for the parents will be in a certain way that it will be staggered, and they don't have to worry about arranging funds at once. Yeah. Now, what are the different kinds of living expenses? There is room and board, that is the hostel and the mess fees, cafeteria fees. Second is the travel and personal expenses. If they're going abroad, they need to make their travel arrangements, their flights, and so on. So health insurance. When you study abroad, all the students are expected to have an health insurance. They need to buy a health insurance for themselves. And finally, books. Books are again another kind of investment or a purchase or a cost that goes towards their living expenses, right? And finally, any incidental or unplanned expenses. So finally, when it comes to studying abroad, of course, within India also or abroad also, there can be other expenses, there are some unplanned expenses. Sometimes you are expected to take a trip with your friends. Sometimes you also go out and have a pizza with them, go out and watch a movie with them. So those are some expenses that you need to take care of, or you need to take into consideration. Those, again, the standard of living of a student. The cost that I'm going to talk about is going to be very general. and it's not going to take into consideration how a student is, spending their lives. Let's start with the cost of undergraduate education in the US, right? So in the front of you, you're seeing a graph here, which breaks down the cost of studies in the US. The yellow portion below shows the tuition fee expenses, and the blue portion above shows the living expenses. All the costs here are mentioned in US dollars, and on the right, you can see the cost also mentioned in Indian rupees, right? INR. Now, the first kind of college, there are, so again, think of the fact that there are various types of various different kinds of colleges out there. In the US, there are public universities, there are private universities, there are liberal arts colleges, and then there are community colleges. A private university is like your Harvard or NYU or Stanford or Syracuse University. The cost, the tuition fees here is usually roughly around $55,000, and the living expenses in a city like New York can go up to $27,000. In a smaller town, that cost will come down slightly. It can be roughly $22,000 per year. But in a city like New York or LA or Seattle, those kind of cities, the cost of living will be pretty high. So the overall cost of studying at a private research university in the US can go up to 82,000 USD per year. So all these costs here are mentioned on a yearly basis. That is a per year cost. When you see it in INR or in rupee terms, that can be roughly around 62 lakh rupees per year. This cost is a cost without any scholarship. So, and I've taken NYU as a benchmark. So I started researching about NYU first, and this cost represented here is an approximate cost of how much how much you would have to pay if you are studying at NYU or another highly selective private research university. The second kind of college is a liberal arts college. Colleges like Harvey Mudd College, Union College, Trinity College, those are all liberal arts college where the tuition fees might even be slightly higher than a highly selective private research university. So if you see here, the tuition fees is about $60,000. And the living expenses, again, it depends from country to country. The living expenses varies from country to country. The living expenses over here, $22,000 is what the living expenses would be uh, when you when you are at a small city or when you're in a smaller town, right? Third kind of college is a public university. A public university is a university which is run by the government of that state in the US. So in the US, there are many universities which are specifically run by the governments of that specific state. So let me give you an example. University like UMass Amherst, that is University of Massachusetts in Amherst, or SUNY, that is State University of New York, or College of Charleston. These are all public universities where the fees is pretty low. And again, the living expenses are also quite low. The fees would be somewhere around $40,000, and the living expenses would be something around $15,000 per year. Again, these are costs per year. All these costs mentioned here are per year. The undergraduate education in the US are roughly, for most of the students, it will be 4 years long. Some students can graduate within 3 or 3.5 years as well. And finally, the fourth kind of college is a community college. A community college is a college, where students study for 2 years before they transfer to a different or a bigger private or a public university. The cost of tuition fees at at a community college is pretty low. It's just about $8,000 to $10,000 per year. But when you go to study at a community college, the living expenses would be similar to what you would pay at another city. So living expenses does not change much. It will still be about $22,000, $20,000 to $25,000. So all these costs you can see, costs to study in various kind of colleges and universities in the US. You can, on the left hand panel, you can see on the left hand side, you can see the USD, that is the cost in USD, and on the right hand side, you can see all the costs in INR. So to study at a private research university, the cost can go up to 60 lakh rupees. To study in a public university, the third one, the cost would be somewhere around 40 lakh rupees per year. Whereas to study at a community college, the cost would be somewhere around 20 lakh rupees per year. That's a little bit about cost of education in the US. So let's talk a little bit about cost of education in the UK. When it comes to the UK, first of all, you need to, again, see in the US, what is different is that the cost of education or the tuition fees does not vary much as per the course that you are studying or as per the major that you're studying. But in the UK, that is not the case. In UK, the course or the cost of education would vary depending upon the course that you are studying. If you are studying medicine, the cost would be much higher. If you're studying engineering, it will be slightly lower. If you're studying economics or business, the cost will be further down. And if you are studying, let's say, psychology or those kind of subjects, the cost will be further down. So there is a significant variation when it comes to the various majors or the various degrees that you're pursuing in the UK. The five different kinds of colleges in the UK is, number one is a public or a university in a city. So when it comes to a university in a city, the tuition fees would be somewhere around $33,000, and the tuition and the living expenses would be somewhere around 18,000 pounds. I'm sorry, not dollars, pounds, right? So while you're talking about that, we should also know that the pound rate, what is the pound rate? It's roughly around 100 rupees right now. And the first kind of university or college that I'm talking about here is UCL, or that's University College London, Imperial College, or LSE, that is London School of Economics. So again, the cost would vary between all of them also, but this number in front of you, 33,000 pounds, will give you a basic idea of how much the tuition fees would be when you go to study in the UK. And as I already mentioned, it will differ as you study different majors. That is something very important to know about when you are guiding students to study in the UK. Living expenses, again, to study in a city, university in a city, the cost of living will be pretty high per year. Whereas when you move, let's talk about Oxford and Cambridge. Yeah. So when it comes to studying at Oxford and Cambridge, the tuition fee itself is about 40,000 pounds. That's a pretty significant amount. So Oxford and Cambridge, studying at Oxford or Cambridge is in itself going to cost higher towards your tuition fees. Living expenses, again, Oxford and Cambridge, the living expenses are also pretty high. The third kind of college is a college in a small town, like University of Bath or University of Bristol. Usually in these universities, the tuition fees might be a little lower, about 25,000 pounds. And the living expenses will definitely be much lower. So living expenses comes down significantly when a student goes to study at a university which is located in a smaller town. So the overall cost of education comes down very significantly when they go to study at a selective university, but which is located in a smaller town. The fourth kind of college is a less selective college, or a college which is not that very selective. And again, there, the cost of the tuition fee itself is pretty low, and the living expenses are also low. So when you are going to study at a less selective university, the cost would definitely come down. The cost of education would definitely come down. And finally, the fifth kind of college that I would like to point out here is if you are studying medicine programs. So as I started telling you earlier, that medicine program at any university is quite expensive, and a lot of universities don't even have enough seats to for international students to study medicine. So that is something you need to be aware of. When I say that, well, there are a lot of universities that do offer medicine programs to the students. So you need to go there and explore these medicine programs on a case-by-case basis. The tuition fees for a medicine program is roughly $50,000, and the living expenses would be somewhere around $16,000. So that takes care of cost of education in the UK. All right, so the cost of education in Canada. Again, Canada is a very diverse country. There are various kinds of colleges available there, and we can talk about the cost of education at a public university in a city, the cost of education at a public university in a small town, then a cost of education in a less selective university, and finally community college. So again, the tuition fees comes down from 45,000 Canadian dollars to 15,000 Canadian dollars. And the living expenses at a city is roughly 21,000 Canadian dollar, whereas living expenses in a public university in a small town or in a less selected is roughly 12,000 Canadian dollars. When you see the cost of Canadian dollars, it's roughly about 55 rupees per dollar, right? So that means when you study at a public university in a city, your cost can go roughly about 40 lakh rupees, 35 to 40 lakh rupees per year. Whereas when you study at a public university in a small town, the cost would be somewhere around 30 lakhs. Whereas when you study at a less selective university, the cost can be brought down to about 20 lakh rupees itself. And I'll just show you some examples of the different kinds of university. I'm sure you have all heard of UBC, U Toronto, Alberta, and McMaster. These are the universities in city or small town. When it comes to a small town university or a less selective university in small town, the cost would be the tuition fees would be low, and the living expenses again would be pretty low, like the University of Saskatchewan. And finally, there are also community colleges in in Canada, where again the tuition fee would be significantly low, and the living expenses would be same as what the living expenses would be when you live in a bigger city. So that's roughly about 20,000 Canadian dollars. So again, you can see the comparison of how the cost can vary across different kinds of colleges. But the point to take home from here is that the cost of education in Canada would be approximately 40 lakhs if you study at a very popular university, roughly 30 lakhs per year if you study at a university in a smaller town. It would be somewhere around 20 lakhs if you study at a less selective university in a small town. That's a little bit about Canada. Let me just move on and talk about Singapore. What would be the cost of education to study in Singapore? So again, the three most popular universities in Singapore are NUS, NTU, SMU. The cost of the tuition fees at NUS is roughly 38,000 Singapore dollars. That's again, Singapore dollars is about 55 rupees per dollar. NTU, Nanyang Technological Institute University, and SMU is Singapore Management University. Again, you can see the cost of the tuition fees at these universities, and again the cost of living is roughly about 10,000 Singapore dollars. That's roughly about 5.5 lakh Indian rupees per year. So when it comes to studying in Singapore, the living expenses are lower as compared to that in UK or Canada or US. But still, when you compare that with India, the living expenses are still very high. It's significantly high. Yeah, that's a little bit about Singapore. And when you see in Singapore, the cost would roughly be around 30 lakh rupees per year. On an average, if you draw an average curve over here, you will see that the average cost would be somewhere around $30,000 per year. All right, let's talk about Europe for a little bit. In Europe, the cost varies very drastically within different countries. Netherlands, France, Germany, Hungary, Spain, and the living expenses also vary very drastically. Right now, let's talk about Netherlands again. In the Netherlands, when we look at University of Amsterdam, the tuition fees is roughly about $12,000, but the living expenses are not dollars. I'm sorry, euro, and living expenses are 14,000 euros. So whereas when you talk about France or Paris, the living expenses are astonishing 22,000 euros. So the living expenses in Europe are pretty high, and that is something you need to be aware of when you are guiding your students, that although the tuition fees might be lower, but the living expenses are high. Again, let's just see how it translates into INR or Indian rupees. So you can see that the tuition fees varies in Germany and in Hungary. A lot of universities, actually in all these countries, a lot of universities are supported by their government. So for private universities, the tuition fee will be higher. But for a lot of public universities like KIT in Germany or the University of Pech in Hungary, the tuition fees is just about 4,000 euros, whereas the living expenses are astonishing 16,000 euros. Again, you need to check what is the rate of currency conversion when it comes to euro, right? Euro, I believe, is somewhere around 90 rupees uh, per euro. The living expenses would be somewhere around 13,000. The tuition fees. If we just talk about France, it would be around 30 lakh rupees per year when you go to study at a university in France, whereas it would be just about 15 lakh rupees per year when you study at a university in Hungary, because the tuition fees is majorly taken care of by their government. Because even for international students, they need to pay a very little amount, 3-4 lakh rupees per year, 5 lakh rupees per year. That's what students pay when they study in India itself, right? So that is something which is a pretty reasonable amount, even as per Indian standards. But the living expenses are something which really changes the whole matrix, and it really increases the cost to study in the Europe. Yeah, that's about Europe. And finally, India. I've just taken 5 case studies over here. What would it cost to study in St. Xavier's, Mumbai, in IITs and IISc, in a private college like BITS Pilani, at a liberal arts college like Kriya University, Flame University, and finally, what would it cost to study medicine at, let's say, Manipal University? So you can all see the cost of education to study in India. It has a whole range, varying, going all the way from about 2 lakh rupees per year, going all the way till 16 to 18 lakh rupees per year. So there are all kinds of possibilities for the students. Usually, anyone who is looking at IITs or NITs, they would pay anywhere about 2.5 lakh rupees. I've taken the case of IIT Bombay. But the cost would vary within these institutes also. And the living expenses would roughly be around 10,000 rupees per year, per month. It can vary. Again, if you're living in Mumbai, the cost can go up. If you're living in a much smaller town, let's say we have counselors from Trichy. So if you're studying at NIT Trichy, the cost of living would come down significantly, and the tuition fees would also be lower at NIT Trichy. When it comes to a private university, again, BITS Pilani, the cost of living is 1.2. If you look at VIT, Vellore Institute of Technology, or SRM, those kind of institutes, this cost will also be higher, and this cost will also be higher. At private, at universities, at liberal arts colleges like Kriya, Flame, Symbiosis, Ashoka, the tuition fees is higher as compared to all the other places, and the living expenses, the room and board and the hostel and all of those fees are also a little higher. I've taken a round number. It can be about 2 lakhs also, 2.5 lakhs also, right? And finally, medicine. Studying medicine anywhere is going to be an expensive affair. The tuition fees per year is about 15 lakh rupees at a private medical university, and the living expenses can go up to 2.5 lakh rupees per year. So that's the cost of education in India. And thank you for listening to this one so patiently.